Hi, I'm Chris from airwindows, and I'm really excited about what I have today because I think I have just improved my most fundamental basic distortion algorithm, and I'll tell you why. I've been using a sine-based algorithm for getting the most smooth distortion possible for some of my sounds. Some of my sounds, like the plug-in drive, it's a different algorithm that's got a little more gnarly grunginess to it, but over and over, I've been using a simple sine function to produce a saturation that, rather than being, like up here and then it clips and is done, slowly beginning to saturate until it reaches the point where it cannot saturate any longer. And that's a sine function. In fact, that's part of what makes console work, because console 5 is based on a sine function and then an arcsine function, which exactly reverses it. And you can see on the screen here, I have a new plugin called Spiral, and I have Purest Console Channel, because Purest Console Channel is one of the simplest versions of Console 5, and as such, the encode of it is literally that sine function. Now, when you use a sine function like that, or what's in density, density uses that as well, what you will get is an incredibly soft, smooth saturation that's kind of fat and heavy, and it makes things come a little bit forwards. And this is all fine within the context of console, because console's designed to do that and then decode it again. It works. But what it sounds like when you're using it on just audio as a saturation is this. I'll turn on old empty pictures, which has a lot of bass, and you'll be able to hear it more easily. And we'll get this rolling. Here's a gain plugin. Here's console channel. I'll turn it back off. Now let's turn this up a little. Here's console channel again. And you can hear that's kind of thick sounding. The plain sound is like this, and then you hear how it made it kind of fatter? Here, we'll lean into it a little bit. Now what's happening here, and I'm using this track specifically because it'll be easier to hear what the saturation is doing, because it's kind of thick and has a lot going on. This is pushing kind of a high output, certainly when it's bypassed. And then I've got bit shift gain on here. Bit shift gain is just -1. So that's the cleanest possible, stepping it back down to what's not going to clip. If I have this small boost, or I'll call it a 3 dB boost, we'll say that, and then switch on console channel, Purest Console Channel, which is the sine wave algorithm, you should be able to hear that it's getting kind of thicker and heavier, and that's the type of distortion that this gets. Turns out I was missing a trick, because one of the things I learned about this sine wave algorithm, way back in the day, I was working on the channel plugin, and I came across a idea. I was going to take the channel plugin and set it up so, like, if this is your smoothest saturation like this, instead I was going to do it in such a way where you would maybe have a amplitude that would just get louder and then start smoothing over using the sine thing when it got to a certain point. And it would be adjustable, so you'd be able to have a bigger curve, and then it would be flat, and this would be the part where it wasn't distorting at all. Well, I tried that. I tried it and I replaced channel with it, and people flipped out. Because the thing is, that was altering the transfer function in the middle of the waveform. And our ears don't hear that as anything good. Our ears hear that as a kind of nasty distortion. And it was amazing how subtle it could be. Like the tiniest little area of completely undistorted stuff before this kicks in, people still heard it as a problem. So I had to roll back that version of channel, and I called it like original channel or something like that, or I went and called the new one new channel, and as near as I can tell, nobody actually ever wanted it, so it was very much like New Coke. But the lesson I learned from that was that when you're doing these saturation functions and they're supposed to sound really good, I can only do a single function that does this smooth curve, and I can't do it out of multiple little functions. I tried that with the reversion of channel, and it failed. And I've always stuck to the sine wave based one ever since. Although I can demonstrate again. This is without. Turn it on. It gets a little tubby. There's a thickness, a fatness to this perfect sine shape. And that's not necessarily bad. That's one of the things that digital most severely lacks. So it's generally been well received by people. Here's the thing. I was watching a video by a YouTuber, Brady Haran, and his number file, because he was talking about the a silver ratio rather than a golden ratio, and I was like, that's interesting. I use the golden ratio for lots of things. It's very useful. Like the golden ratio is ideal for all-pass filters in reverbs, for instance, and there's just lots of useful stuff that you can do with it. And he showed this image. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that before. If you've ever watched videos about things like the golden ratio, you will have seen it. And it is the way you construct a spiral out of just, you've got your square, and then this is the curve, and then you have your smaller square that fits into the rest of the ratio, and that's the curve, and then it's still smaller square, and so on. And Brady just blew my entire mind by pointing out this is not a real thing. This is not a spiral. This is a bunch of squares with sine wave shaped circle sections in them. That's not the real spiral. And when he was explaining this, that the real spiral is going to be a different shape that naturally follows along with this thing, and there's going to be a different spiral for like the silver ratio and so on, my jaw was like, because I realized that my sine wave distortion algorithm also was not the real algorithm. It was not the real ideal optimal distortion algorithm, which I'd been saying that it was, because it's the smoothest possible curve between any 2 points. It's the one with the least amount of change, but it can't do a real spiral. It's not the actual way to have the smoothest possible transition from undistorted to fully distorted. Instead, it's always applying the same amount of distortion, and that's what makes it sound kind of fat. I'll play that yet again for you. And you can hear that, I'll tone it back to 3 dB. And this slightly fat sound is the smallest possible change for any given moment, but it's not the smoothest possible transition between undistorted at the very lowest place and fully distorted at the top of the distortion curve. This is. And the way I get that is we'll rotate it like this. This can be the top of the distortion curve. And then what I will do is take the input value that's coming in and go, okay, this goes from like -1 to 1. Say it's at 0.5. I'll go the input value, the sample thing, at 0.5 times 0.5. Yep, just got smaller. Then do the sine wave thing of that. Oh, look, it had less of an effect. And then when we're finished doing that, multiply it by that original 0.5 again, putting it back. Doing that, I have the full effect of the sine as it goes to 1. And then the smaller it gets, the more, and this is something that single-ended triode does with the second harmonic. That plugin does its entire thing by scaling the sine wave function that it sits in up or down depending upon how your setting is set. So what it does is it'll divide the input signal and make it smaller if you don't want as much of an effect, and then it applies the same function and then puts it back afterwards, scales it down, scales it up by exactly the same amount. And the neat thing is doing this algorithm this way and using a couple of tricks, like there's a ternary operator in there. There's just simple math and programmer tricks. It's nothing really very fancy. The original one was a number of lines of code doing this very simple thing to make sure that it was not dividing by 0 or anything silly like that. And the current one, which will be visible as open source in the Spiral source code, 1 line of code. And it sounds kind of like this. We'll start with Purist console channel. Spiral sounds like this. That's quite distorted. But it might not sound that distorted because it's not adding fatness and thickness to the sound. It's applying a distortion that is as smooth as possible and is applying it in this special spiral way, which causes it to not alter the thickness or tonality of the sound. And I can demonstrate that by turning it on and off. Off. 1. So here's what's going on there. This is the new ultimate distortion algorithm as near as I can work out. It's very simple. It's 1 line of code. And there's an interesting side effect to that, which I will show you after I turn bit shift gain down a little bit, because here's where things get messy. Let's make it 4 bits down. Sounds like this. Now if we have this, you can tell that's not very loud. I can turn it off. One thing that you'll notice with this is that if you have a signal that's like at 0 dB coming in, like you can put this on a track, as similar with Purist console channel, this has no controls. You can put this on a track and it will cut the maximum output down to about -1.4 dB. It's a really good safety clipper that way. And if you're using it in that context where the signal is not going above 1, where the signal is not going above 0 dB, like if you're capturing something and this is the track that you captured straight off of your digital input, then Spiral will always play nice. It will always saturate in a way that sounds really like, well, here, I'll show you. This is nothing, no gain or boost or anything. Here's Purist console channel. It's a little fatter. And here is spiral cut in and out on just the signal coming in, no alterations otherwise. Turn it back off. Now it has an interesting effect in that it's probably more effective as a analogizer than even channel. As far as putting on a distortion that makes things sound like real life instead of the imaginary insides of a computer, I think this is pretty hard to beat. And there's nothing fancy going on about it. There's just that one line of code, and it's the optimal, the spiral-shaped optimal distortion curve. But there's something else, and that's something that I think Purist Console Channel also shares. Since this is such a simple algorithm, if you push it to a certain point, you have maximized the amount of saturation. It's like it sort of slowly rounds off until it just flattens again. Let's pretend that is 1.4 dB. I've written the exact amount down in the code, but I'm not quite sure what it is in dB. It's like 1.2 something or other as a ratio. Here's what you get. Without clipping, it's like this. And with clipping, it's like this. In fact, for fun, let's go to something where we'll be able to hear the distortion better. Alien Kittens, our old classic synthetic thing. And I'll show you what the console channel does. A little thicker, a little fatter. And then I'll cut in spiral. You'll notice that we are getting the same amount of depth, the same amount of shape, but everything is a little bit more focused. It's like it's coming from a specific place. But then we can get silly. I turned it down like this for a reason. If we just used a regular gain, we could put it back up. When I turn it on, sorry. To an output, and then if we have some kind of saturation in there, like just for laughs, let's throw in let's see, not the quick voice clip, but clip only. Now if we throw this guy in here, we're going to start to hear a distortion that is something fierce. This is the transient controlled airwindows clipper. It's just a straight up raw clipper. So you can splat it pretty hard, and this is what you get. If you try that with Purist Console Channel, which is just a sine function, you get something a little bit weird, because what's happening is the sine doesn't just stop here. What a sine does is go around here. So if you're using console or Purist Console Channel that's just plain a sine wave, and this is not the case for density, because density clips you right here and makes sure it doesn't get any farther. But if you don't do that, and Purist Console Channel doesn't do that, it's not designed to be slammed for tone, it's designed as a mix tool. It'll keep going around until getting louder causes you to get quieter. And this is how my plugin Fracture works, because Fracture does that on purpose. And then it'll continue to go around until it finally comes back where it began. But what happens when you're doing that with a heavily distorted sound is it kind of wraps. It becomes nasty and crunchy, but in a weird way, like this. Obvious distortion. Now it's weird. It's getting garbled. Even more garbled. And that's kind of what Fracture does. Fracture exists in Purist console channel because that doesn't clip the wraparound. It'll continue following the sine around. So inside every Purist console channel, you could thrash it, slam it with level, and then you would have this strange garbled sound. But Spiral doesn't do this. Spiral applies this function where it starts out much slower, and then it goes around, and then as you go past the saturation point, it'll continue to accelerate, it'll continue to tighten. And what that does is it gives it a very interesting, strange, ultimate sort of semi-analog-y slam factor. And I'll show that to you now. Goes kind of like this. Spiral. You can start to hear it break up. See, if you were treating it as if it was a analog device, you can hear where it starts to really crunch, and by ear, stay away from that point. And again, if you're just using it on the tracks that you've recorded directly, it'll never happen because you have to push it quite far in order to get to this point. But here's what you get. There's the crunch. There's an even more severe crunch. So what do you think of that? That is Spiral as the simplest possible gain stage. And yeah, if you were using this algorithm for your own distortions, you can always put a hard clip in there to make sure it doesn't go beyond the point where it starts to wrap back around. But as you can see, if it does start to wrap back around, it fries in a really interesting way that I think is more characteristic of just blowing up an analog circuit than, say, Purist console channel, or the simple sine-based stuff like Fracture is more inclined to just give you a behavior rather than acting like you're frying some kind of analog electronic thing to the point where it's just flipping out. And of course, you can fry Spiral in other ways as well. For instance, here's something anything, and this has a lot of headroom, so you can hear what it sounds like to beat up on this distortion algorithm that is yours to use because it is free. As you can see, there are no controls. You just stage your gain into it. Oh, hit that by accident. And that's because my scroll wheel does it. That's interesting and not entirely useful. See, it sounds basically nice until you go a little farther. So what's happening here is most of the audio is fairly respectable, but the drums are going crazy because the drums have much bigger... Here, I'll turn it up a little bit. The drums there have much higher transients, so what you're getting is Spiral flipping out only on the drum heads. And I can compare that with Purist console channel. And it's thicker and fatter, as you've heard. And then to round it off, here is a actual recorded drum clip, which is mostly like room drums. And you can hear what that one sounds like through console channel, and then I'll switch it to spiral. So this has a lot of headroom, so we'll push it much farther. And again, we could also just a regular clipper is this. Purist console channel is this. And then spiral. When it goes cycle loud and gets way too much, all of the distortion stuff, rather than turning into low frequency things like the regular sine wave will do it, it just goes kind of bonkers very rapidly. So you have complete trash here. Or turn down just enough that most of the sound is pretty clean. And then when you have a really big transient, it goes bonkers and starts throwing all of that nasty highs. But, you know, nasty is a state of mind. Maybe it's nice highs. And if that seems a little bit too much, we'll turn it back down again. That bass drum gets a little bigger. Or we'll clean it up a little bit again. And that's still distorting. But this is the kind of thing that you would want out of clipping a drum kit in such a way that the loud stuff gets loud and sounds distorted in a useful way. And again, we'll compare that with just raw hard clipping. It's just not bringing the same kind of mojo. It's distorting, but it's not the same. And then console channel. It's a little fatter, it's a little thicker. This is not bad sounding, but it's kind of soft. Then spiral. So there's a new best distortion algorithm in town. Mind you, I'm not going to use it on absolutely everything because there are things like, for instance, Purist console channel is meant to work with another plugin, namely Purist console bus. And console 5 works that way. It's designed to do a sound that can be reproduced and decode it again. Like here's Purist console channel and Purist console bus both together at a normal level. And if you turn both of them on, by design, nothing happens. That was just the bus kicking in. And then we'll turn them off. So some of these things and the use of this sine-based distortion algorithm, it has uses besides just the tone quality. But if you're looking for tone quality, spiral is the new thing. And even set at low levels, or for instance, you just throw it on a random track and it will constrain the track down to, well, here we've got it so quiet. Why don't I throw on this old quick voice clip track that was recorded through a little microphone like this one, as an example of what you get when you just obliterate the microphone and blow it up. The idea is to soften that and make it sound kind of nicer. So our experiment now is going to be, we'll hear a little bit of this, turned way down with pitch shift gain, of course. Playing my video game and oh my god, something attacked me! Ah! So that's kind of silly. But I'm pretending to be in the middle of a video game and blowing up the mic. Here's what it sounds like without it. Playing my video game and oh my god, something attacked me! Ah! That's pretty loud. And I got a minus 0.1 peak level because that's what the quick voice clip recording, that's what this recording got to. Whereas if I turn on spiral, playing my video game and oh my god, something attacked me! Ah! And you'll notice that not only did this only go up to minus 1.4, not only does it also produce a sound that does not clip between samples. This pretty much stops intersample clips because it takes down the level to the point where that's not going to happen. But it also made the distortion settle in a little bit more smoothly. That did not sound as completely nasty as the raw sound did. And I'll demonstrate that again on this a little bit. It's down because the guy who was recording it was getting really loud. Ah! I don't normally do that, so I sound very silly when I do. The guy who was recording it was getting really loud. Ah! And you heard how splatted that was. Now, if I put spiral on, what we get is this. Your video makes down because the guy who was recording it was getting really loud. Ah! It sounds more like it's being distorted inside the mic somewhere, rather than being distorted in the analog to digital converter or inside the DAW. It's just softening it down a great deal because it's getting into a level of clipping sooner, but it's going into it in this spiral-based way. And it's just, yeah, I'm very pleased with this one. I think a lot of people are going to get a lot of fun out of it, and it's going to find its way into other plugins of mine. Definitely. It can find its way into other plugins of other people's as well, because this is open source. What you need to do is credit me if you use this, because you can hear it, and I'm saying wonderful things about it, which are all true. And you can even tame it by making it not do the wraparound thing and throw all those highs. But you can also include it in your own software as long as you credit my work. It is MIT licensed, meaning that it's not stopping you from doing anything commercial with it. Pretty much all you have to do is give credit. And it's probably pretty traceable, like run a sine wave through it and you'll be able to determine that it's this algorithm. So play fair and do give the credit, but this is out there for people to use. I don't think it has existed before now. And it's my new best. It's my new best distortion algorithm. I like it a lot. It's supported by Patreon. That's how come I'm still around doing this thing, because this is a completely current one. This didn't exist last week. And I hope you like it as much as I like it. Thank you.